This is CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge & Company. We know that what happens or doesn't happen to children in their earliest years is of critical importance to their futures and to society as a whole. That's why I can't understand why our public and legislative policies fail to reflect this knowledge and choose not to invest heavily in early childhood development. I've asked Dr. Virginia Casper, an internationally known developmental psychologist and Director of Infant and Family Development and Early Intervention Programs at Bank Street College, to share my frustration and discuss what a major investment would mean. So,
thank you so much, Ronnie.
You're welcome. Are you as frustrated? Enraged, better, right?
Yes, it's so enraging, it's tiring, because it's been forever. And I wish I understood it better. I really...
Of why?
The why,
yeah.
I mean, I have some ideas. Some of it is that I think people don't really understand early childhood. And, you know, we've come some way as a society with the neuroscientific findings, and, you know, they're spread all over Time magazine when it was. You know, on the one hand, but it's not a deep understanding. And it's a bit of a mechanistic understanding, and I think, you know, babies, for example, are not really seen as human beings, or that learning really begins, you know,
right after
right at the very beginning. You know, we won't say exactly what that is, but it's at the beginning.
Right. I mean, it's so important, isn't it? The bonding. Tell us what happens 0 to 3 months.
Okay, so you know, even early on, babies are growing, and parents are imagining already, having an idea, a representation of who this baby will be. They may be wishing for a certain kind of child, you know, thinking of Uncle Richard or, you know, Aunt Sue, and, you know, or a grandmother, and thinking about names, and already becoming close to whoever this child will become. At birth, there are all kinds of hormones that are kicking in, and evolution has just done us a wonderful service of making babies delicious to look at. They have those big eyes, they have those yummy cheeks, they have those fleshy thighs, you know, and you just, like, you can't just feel nothing, you know. There's an attraction, and if there is some connection to you, it's even greater. I think it's very similar for families who adopt. You know, it looks different, but the fantasies and the internal representations of who is this child. Andrew Solomon just wrote a book, I'm sure you're familiar with, Far from the Tree, and he talks about this really universal phenomenon of, you know, here's this baby, and, like, who are you? You know, like, wow, who are you? You know, and he talks about in particular when babies are very different from who you may feel you are as a person, you know. So,
but what I understand also is that it's important that that warmth and bonding happen almost immediately, that's necessary.
It is, and you know, babies are a little more plastic and malleable, both physically and emotionally. You know, that's the best. But there are mothers who are, let's say, depressed for the first 10 days and aren't able to provide that, let's just say, right? But maybe someone else can. Right? So I think sometimes, and it's a little bit of the mechanistic approach, you know, you have an image that it has to be the mother.
It does, yeah. It doesn't have to, but it should be somebody.
It should be somebody, and you know, consistency is important. culture varies. In some places, consistency means the first 5 people around, but consistently the first 5 people around, right? And because I do work internationally, it helps me constantly keep that view of thinking about all babies in all situations, which is very hard to do in our culture, you know, because we're just bombarded with images of who the perfect baby and family is about, you know, and it's hard to kind of get out of that and think, well, there's really a range.
So is that when a baby's still in the hospital and say it's premature or some problems, it's still important for someone there to hold the baby at some point?
Absolutely. I mean, the skin to skin, you know, babies who are premature have not had that time in utero for flexion. You know, the more time you're in utero, the more you're flexed and beginning to extend out. And so if you've ever seen a premature baby in the hospital, they look a little like chickens. You know, they don't have that tone. They don't. And so the first year of life physically is really about being able to flex and extend and move against gravity. Some people say gravity is the first mother.
That's
you know, because
interesting.
you're really moving against it. Yeah, and evolutionarily, babies are made to be able to see best for the first 3 or 4 months for about 18 inches, which is literally the distance from the breast.
Isn't that interesting?
To the face.
You know, I told you before that years ago when I had my first baby, I was working at CBS, and the question was I going to go back to work or stay home? And we were fortunate enough that my husband was making enough money I could stay home, I guess, if I wanted to. And everybody at CBS said, well, look at this Scientific American issue. And it was about an experiment where they were making wire monkey mothers. They were wrapping a wire frame with all these things and heating them, I think, and I don't know, I seem to remember a clock being one of them, so you had a ticking heart. And that when the baby monkeys were born, they were immediately attached to that wire monkey. Everybody said, well, see, you don't need to be around. Well, then it turned out the next year or 2 years later, those baby monkeys all had extreme behavioral problems.
I was going to say, they didn't read the fine print of the article.
Or the rest of the conclusions.
So
that just made me think about what happens when children are in an institution or not taken home with a mother. How much is emphasized about bonding and holding those babies and developing them, and is that sometimes the cause that we see some children who come from different places that are not?
It can be.
Affects their behavior later on.
It can be, and it's one of the big issues in the field is thinking about how do babies change? How does development really happen, right? And one of the newer ways that we're thinking about it is more like systems. Like if you think about when Sandy happened, you know, there were a couple of days before where the weathercasters were saying, we know a storm's coming. We won't know if it's the storm of the century or if it's going to be as big as it is until, I don't know about this, but you know, this air mass in Canada, and they're coming in from the south, and if they meet, X will happen, and if they don't, Y will happen. And in a way, development is like that, except it's at the molecular, at the physical, at the emotional, you know, at every level, there are so many variables. And it's almost impossible to keep up with, right? So, you know, you can be in an orphanage and someone can walk by every day and stop and talk to the baby, 10-month-old, you know, and spend an hour there or not. You can have orphanages where the baby is assigned someone and you know, who is loving, and maybe it's not enough, but it makes a difference from the babies who don't have that. And where do they go? You know, are they then adopted into a family where there's a nanny who leaves every year? Or they are adopted into a family where there's a father who works at home and is, you know, basically raises that child as a primary caregiver, or as you know, he and his partner or whatever. So there's, I hope I'm being clear, there are so many ways that it can unfold. There's so many ways that it can look like at the time, and then so many different ways that it can unfold.
Right, and some of the different ways can be legitimate and helpful. It doesn't matter.
Absolutely.
We don't have to have strict ways of doing it. It's just that we need the end product.
Yeah, and this issue of continuity really comes back to your original question, because what we hope for in early childhood is not just a program that will come in and be an intervention at age 2 and then off it goes, right? You need, and this is what some of the EduCare and programs in Head Start have advocated for a really long time, which is that you need to work with families before birth, during birth, after birth, and have some consistent community support, emotional support, all the way through into school. And some of the arguments about Head Start, for example, have to do with at what point did the intervention end, right? That if you just do an intervention and then forget about it.
What do you mean by an intervention?
Head Start could be seen as an intervention for some children, because there are wonderful experiences that they might not have.
Right, but does it come too late? Children. Sometimes.
Sometimes it may come too late. There's early Head Start for very young
Do we
children.
not spend enough time, as you said, before a baby is born, on parenting skills? And it doesn't have to be parenting skills. What do you call it if it's not parenting skills?
I think it's
information.
I think it's actually helping parents think about why they want to be parents, what their goals are. Every parent has goals, but they may not be aware of what those goals are. They may be able to use some help in articulating what those goals are, and then saying, well, what would you think you could do to allow that goal to come to fruition more easily, as opposed to a class where you say, you need to talk to your baby when you change the diaper. Well, why should I do that, right? Whereas if you learn a little, I'm a firm believer in this. It makes me a little nuts. It's part of my deep frustration is that we have so many books about parenting. They just line the shelves of the libraries and bookstores and online. And parents are a little disenfranchised about their own knowledge that they can develop of observing their own children, thinking together with their partner or their grandmother or whoever about what might come next. Their neighbors and their friends are telling them you should help your baby to sleep this way. Oh no, you mustn't. You must do it that way. And less than 100 years ago, people just did what their families did.
Right.
We didn't have all these choices.
But it's important, isn't it, though, that we understand it sort of at the different phases that they begin to develop these skills that they need in later life. That if you're not talking to a baby a lot, you need that verbal skill.
Yes, on the one hand, and on the other hand, there are cultures within this country and subcultures where storytelling is the tradition. And, if you're singing and talking, I think that's a good example.
Well, there are all ways of doing it.
Yeah, you don't have to
one
have
way.
your 9-month-old turning.
Right.
We think it's great for 9-month-olds to turn pages and look at books and have that conversation.
But don't feel guilty
and
if they're not.
Proto-conversation, yeah. And it's also how many things are helping a baby. Sometimes parents will say to me, oh, I wish I'd known and done that, and and I'll say, well, you did this, and you did this, and you did this, and it's why some interventions, just one intervention in a very multiply stressed family, where there are just all kinds of things coming to pressure a mother and a father, let's say, and a whole family. One intervention can make a huge difference in that case, whereas that same intervention, if there are 12 other things the parent is doing, it'll just be a drop in the bucket.
Important. So Head Start, though, we should have more Head Start?
Absolutely, and early Head Start, and they're really meaningful programs. There's community support, families learn from each other, they work together, and they learn about exactly this. They talk about their children. They don't necessarily have a lecture about how to, take care of your baby, but, talking about in a given culture, this is how we do it. And does this make sense? And I don't know what.
We have all these discussions. All this attention on schools and failing, and the students who are dropping out, the number of students dropping out, the number of kids that are failing, and the different scores, and the way we're going to have teachers accountable, et cetera, et cetera. but we neglect the importance of that early childhood education and how it would help the children once they go beyond.
Absolutely.
Why is that, do you
Well,
think?
and the achievement gap actually can be said to start in the womb. And there's new research that's pretty scary. The highest number of low birth weight and premature babies are born to African American women in this country. And a new study compared that with Hispanic women and with Black African women who had immigrated to this country. So, you know, was it genetic? No. And it's really about institutionalized racism and the stresses of it, so that middle-class Black women still have very high low birth weight
Why?
babies.
Now why?
Because it's this, people are arguing that it's the stress of racism, that even in a middle class environment where you expect certain things, but they're not happening, or in the rest of the society where there are, you know, that from birth a woman is experiencing racism all the way, and that takes a toll on her own emotional development and stress. I mean, we've learned a lot from neuroscience about how much stress raises cortisol levels, changes neurochemicals that connect to each other. And for children, it's true. I mean, children are resilient up till about 8 or 9. You know, they're physically resilient. You know, we believe that if they have one person who loves them, you know, they will persevere. But at the same time, with constant stress, it changes the architecture of the brain and emotional development. And it's one of these situations where there are many systems working, and it's not so clear how it turns out, depending on the balance of the stresses and the supports. But
So if a middle-class African-American woman has a lot of stress, what about a single-parent, poor
exactly.
woman?
Exactly.
And what do we offer them as a society?
Well, specifically in the child rearing area, there is something called a doula that is really taking off, and a lot of young women are training to learn how to do it, which is not at the level of a midwife, but is someone who before birth, during birth, you know, pre, peri, and post, is with the mother and an advocate. You know, so they're the peep, they're the person, you know, they're the person to call an emergency, they're the person who comes to get groceries, they're the person who holds your hand during delivery if you don't have a best friend or someone. And it's the person who comes in afterwards and says, how was it? Was that what you were expecting? You know, and if it wasn't, let's talk about it. And is able to really help a woman make those choices about breastfeeding. And we know breastfeeding is so much better for so many reasons. There are women who choose not to. And, you know, people in the field have to respect that and help them make a choice that
So are
works for
they
them.
part of our public health, and are their services funded by
No.
the government?
And as well, you know, Barry Brazelton and Dr. Nugent, I'm just blocking his name for the moment, years ago came up with a neonatal scale to kind of get a sense, not just are all the fingers and toes there and, you know, what's the APGAR, but really who is this baby and how might the baby best be go into the next stage, you know, like, is it a cuddly baby? Is it a slightly skittish baby? You know, do you want to be careful with the lights or doesn't it matter? And it's a tool. Early in my training, I had the privilege of doing with many babies and got to know them as individuals, you know, in a way that's just so incredible. But that's something that if that was available, there's a short version of it, if that was available in every hospital to do with parents, it's an incredible way to begin being a parent, by seeing that a baby can turn, can, you know, can turn to a noise, can follow you, can follow a little red ball. And parents just brim with pride.
Smile.
And it starts you off thinking about what you can do with your baby. You know, it's not just like, so there are
So this
many
should
things.
be
And home
there.
visiting, clearly, you know, there's so many
But
things that can
in
be-
my
can
years in
happen.
city council, I never even heard a discussion of that. Why?
Well, I think some of the funding comes down Federally.
Federally.
And, you know, our early intervention situation right now in New York is in a real shambles.
Was there such a program?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. For
State
years
program?
and years. No, it went from the federal government, from IDEA, to the state, to the city. And now it's going back to funding coming, the billing going to the state. It's
And what
hard
did
to
it do?
explain. It's become more complex, and many agencies can no longer afford to have someone to push the button for the trunk line all day long. They're clinical people, they have clinical skills, they can't spend their time authorizing one
Case.
one actual session at a time. So you see early intervention services, I'm surprised that nothing has been written about this more.
Where does that come from? I mean, if you want early intervention services, the doctor starts the project, or who starts it?
Anyone can start the process, actually. If you see that my baby looks like he's really having a hard time and I seem to be lost in the ether, you can call and say, you know, there's a baby who I'm concerned about. But you really ultimately need the parents' permission. So it's a very ironic situation, given that there now seem like there will be some funds from the Obama administration for early childhood,
and some emphasis on the studying of the brain, which must also affect it a little bit.
Yes, it has been very helpful. It has been very helpful.
I remember reading in the paper about the arrest of a young woman whose child died of malnutrition because she wasn't breastfeeding the child the right way. And it became a big lawsuit. I went and bailed her out, and Karen Burston took her as a client because she wasn't taught how to breastfeed. When she took the baby back to the hospital, somehow she didn't have a card for her Medicaid or something, and the baby died. Now, that is slipping through a system, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's just incredible to me that this happens.
And I can see, unfortunately, I can see something like that actually happening.
Yeah.
You know, and a real will and desire to breastfeed, but
not knowing.
And not being able to distinguish when it's time to go get help.
So we spend a lot of time talking about, I mean, we don't even really talk about Head Start that much now in the city. We talk about childcare, which is totally, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, inadequate, the system that we have. It's so complicated, you can't understand it, and it doesn't begin to come up to the need of it, right? And then we talk about pre-K. Well, by the time a child gets to pre-K, if some of the different things that should happen don't happen, is that child already going to be at a disadvantage?
Well, as I said, it depends on what other factors are happening. You know, I think you do need, I think in our today's world, you need pre-K. You know, they learn how to be with other children, they learn about being in groups, and with the push down to, you know, kindergarten being kind of like first grade and first grade being like second grade, it really makes a difference. Now, I've seen some children come into kindergarten and first grade without any preschool, and if they have someone, some of my students have gone and worked with them more individually, they can make tremendous strides. But if there isn't someone there in the public school system to be able to do that and give some individual attention, it can become very hard.
They're never going to catch up.
Yeah, yeah. And low birth weight children, for example, you know, are susceptible to some learning issues, you know, if there is an intervention early on.
Are we ever going to be able to to develop the system that all children are going to be able to start with advantages that some now have and others don't?
I don't know, Ronnie, and some of the advantages that others have are a bit much. You know?
Oh, too much. There's no doubt. The contrast. The being tutored to get into nursery school.
Well, and someone described this machine that attaches to the stroller that holds the iPad for the toddler. No. Yes. You know, so, you know, you have to ask, and the 2-year-old who has a unit block, who a colleague of mine saw, she was playing with the unit block with the long blocks and the short block, and she takes the short block and she looks at it and she starts going like this, you know, which actually is a very creative
Way of doing
response to her experience of iPhones. But she has the ability to turn it into something else,
Yeah.
a symbolic experience, which makes all the difference.
So we really are a society that is increasingly, I think, becoming more unequal. I mean, I think so. As we see the middle class children being tutored and given all of these different things and the other children not, well, I mean, what are we going to do?
Well, we can advocate, we can...
Who do you advocate? Who do you go to?
Well, I think, you know, we can advocate at all different levels of government. I think that there has been some real advocacy
Right.
for early childhood through some of the neuroscience findings, and a number of foundations and advocacy groups have grown up in the last 10 years. You know, it's a question of where that money will go, what it will be used for. Will it really go to the children who need it? You know, there's about a 10-year-old venture called EduCare, which goes from before birth and helps transition children into
I think I
a
saw
local
that on,
school.
It's on the internet.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And, you know, that really allows for a lot of childcare to interact with that program and learn about, you know, do staff development, and allows for what I talked about earlier, which is some kind of continuity of caregivers, continuity of people in the community, and, you know, the ability to go visit the school you're going to go to next year,
Yeah.
the big school, you know, and have some of those children come and read to you during the year, so that there's really a sense of community, which is such an important piece that we've really lost.
Yes, I think we have to have another discussion about
Community.
But
And
we're finished
raising
with our
kids.
half hour, which is amazing.
Kind of amazing,
Thank
I would
you
say.
very much, Virginia. And is there any website people could look at, do you think?
For
Information about
information,
things. Maybe this EduCare?
yes, and certainly go to the Bank Street website for
Definitely.
a lot of information.
Okay.
Yeah, Neurons to Neighborhoods has a lot on
Okay.
neuroscience.
Well, great.
There are
And
many.
I wish you all the luck in the world, and I hope we can all help to develop this into a broader recognition, I think, and demand for it.
And thank you so much for thinking about the very youngest children.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore? Please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.